The summer heat pressed down on the small town, making the air heavy and the streets shimmer. Aaron Moore hurried along the cracked pavement, his patched backpack bouncing against his thin shoulders. He was running late for his shift at Joe's garage, where he worked part-time after school. His shoes, scuffed and worn, barely held together. Each step scraped the ground, but Aaron didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. As he passed through Haven Park, Aaron's stomach rumbled. He glanced at the sandwich in his hand, the only meal he'd have until dinner, if they even had enough food at home tonight. Around him, families picnicked under the shade of large oak trees. Children laughed as they chased each other, their carefree joy cutting through Aaron's weary thoughts. He looked away, unwilling to let envy take root. At the edge of the park, something caught his attention. An elderly man sat on a weathered bench, staring blankly into the distance. His white hair was unkempt, his clothes rumpled. Aaron hesitated, his steps slowing. The man looked lost, out of place among the laughter and noise of the park. Aaron shifted from foot to foot. His stomach growled again, but he ignored it, looking down at the sandwich in his hand. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Always help if you can, Aaron. A small act of kindness can mean the world to someone. Taking a deep breath, Aaron walked over to the bench. Sir, he asked hesitantly, are you okay? The man looked up, his eyes cloudy and distant. He blinked, as if trying to piece together where he was. Aaron swallowed, his throat dry. Do you need something to eat? He asked, holding out his sandwich. The man's gaze dropped to the food. Slowly, a faint smile spread across his face, and he gave a small nod. Thank you, son, he said, his voice trembling. Aaron sat beside him, tearing the sandwich in half. He handed one piece to the man and kept the other for himself. Together, they ate in silence, the hum of the park around them. After a few moments, a voice broke through the stillness. Dad. Aaron looked up to see a tall man in a suit walking briskly toward them. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel path, and his face was etched with worry. There you are, the man said, his voice tight with relief. He crouched down, gently taking the elderly man's hands. I've been looking for you everywhere. The old man gave a faint nod, but didn't say much. The man in the suit turned to Aaron, his gaze softening as he took in the scene. The shared sandwich, the quiet camaraderie. Were you with him this whole time? The man asked. Aaron nodded, his voice quiet. Yeah, he looked like he needed help. I just didn't want to leave him alone. The man's expression shifted to one of gratitude. He let out a breath and extended his hand. Thank you. Really. I'm Elliot Hensley. This is my father. He has Alzheimer's, and sometimes he wanders off. I can't tell you how much it means that you stayed with him. Aaron shrugged, feeling awkward under Elliot's gaze. It's nothing, sir. I just thought someone should help. Elliot smiled faintly, but there was something deeper in his eyes, an appreciation that words couldn't quite express. He helped his father to his feet, steadying him. Thank you, Elliot said again before leading his father away. Aaron sat on the bench for a moment longer, staring at the half-eaten piece of his sandwich. His stomach growled, but he didn't care. A small warmth had taken root in his chest, a quiet satisfaction that made the hunger easier to bear. As the sun dipped lower, Aaron stood up, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and headed home. The house was small and dark, the electricity cut off again. His mother, Linda, sat at the kitchen table, her face lined with worry as she sorted through a stack of unpaid bills. You're late, she said softly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Sorry, Ma, Aaron replied, setting his bag down. I stopped to help someone. Linda gave him a tired smile. You always do. Aaron didn't tell her about the man in the suit or his father. It felt like a moment that didn't quite fit into their world of frayed shoes and empty cupboards. Instead, he sat down to help her sort the bills, the quiet ticking of a clock filling the room. But that night, as Aaron lay in bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about the old man and the way Elliot had looked at him, as if Aaron had done something extraordinary. Little did he know, that small act of kindness would soon change everything. The faint light of dawn crept through the cracks in the curtains, illuminating the small kitchen. Aaron woke to the soft clatter of dishes. He stumbled into the kitchen to find his mother, Linda, pouring water into a dented kettle. She looked as she always did, tired but determined. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she was already wearing her worn-out uniform for the local seamstress shop. "Morning, Ma," Aaron mumbled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," she replied, her voice gentle. She placed a slice of bread on a plate and slid it across the table. "Eat something before school." Aaron glanced at the single slice. "What about you?" Linda waved him off. "I'm fine. You need it more." He wanted to argue but didn't. He sat down and ate in silence while Linda flipped through a stack of unpaid bills. She sighed, pressing a hand to her forehead. "How much do we need for the electricity?" Aaron asked, his voice quiet. Linda hesitated, then said, "About $150. I'm trying to work extra shifts, but—" her voice trailed off. Aaron clenched his fists under the table. He hated seeing her like this, carrying the weight of their struggles alone. "I'll see if Joe has more hours for me at the garage," he offered. Linda looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're already working so hard, Aaron. You shouldn't have to worry about this. It's not fair." Fair. Aaron nearly laughed at the word. Fair didn't exist in their world. The rich families in town, the Davenports, the Carmichaels, lived in sprawling mansions with more rooms than they could use, while people like his family scraped by in cramped homes with leaky roofs. "Don't worry, Ma. I'll figure something out," Aaron said, forcing a smile. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I know you will. You always do." At school, the weight of Aaron's reality grew heavier. His patched shoes and second-hand clothes made him a target for kids like Zach Carmichael, the son of their landlord. Zach strutted through the hallways with his perfectly styled hair and designer sneakers, always surrounded by a pack of equally privileged friends. As Aaron walked to his locker, Zach stepped into his path, blocking his way. "Hey, more," Zach sneered. "Didn't know they let charity cases into school." Aaron ignored him, keeping his eyes down as he tried to step around. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Zach said, shoving Aaron's shoulder. Aaron stumbled but didn't retaliate. "Leave me alone, Zach," he muttered. "What's the matter? Afraid I'll tear that fancy backpack of yours?" "Oh, wait, it's already falling apart," Zach said, laughing. His friends joined in, their voices echoing in the hallway. Aaron's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He couldn't afford to get into trouble, not with everything else going on. That afternoon, Aaron headed straight to Joe's garage. The smell of oil and grease greeted him as he stepped inside. Joe Garcia, the owner, was under the hood of an old pickup truck. He looked up when he saw Aaron. "Hey, kid. You're early today," Joe said, wiping his hands on a rack. Aaron set his backpack down and grabbed a pair of gloves. "Thought I'd get a head start. Got anything for me?" Joe nodded toward a pile of tools. "Sort those by size, and then you can help me with the truck." Aaron got to work, his hands moving quickly. He liked it here. The garage was one of the few places where things made sense, where hard work paid off and people didn't look down on him. After an hour, Joe handed him a bottle of water and sat down beside him. "How's your mom doing?" Joe asked. Aaron hesitated, then said, "She's trying. We're behind on the bills again." Joe frowned, his brow furrowing. "That's tough, kid. Your mom's a good woman. Always has been." "Yeah," Aaron said, his voice quiet. "She deserves better." Joe nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Here," he said, handing it to Aaron. Aaron stared at it, confused. "What's this?" "In advance on your pay. Don't argue. Just take it," Joe said firmly. Aaron's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse, but he also knew how much his family needed it. "Thanks, Joe," he said softly, tucking the envelope into his pocket. When Aaron got home that evening, he handed the envelope to Linda. Her eyes widened as she opened it, seeing the cash inside. "Aaron, where did this come from?" she asked. "Joe gave me an advance," Aaron said. "He knows we're struggling." Linda pressed her lips together, her eyes filling with tears. "You shouldn't have to do this, Aaron. It's not your job to take care of us." Aaron shook his head. "It's our job to take care of each other, right?" Linda hugged him tightly, and for a moment, The weight on Aaron's shoulders felt a little lighter. But that night, as he lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, Aaron couldn't shake the bitterness in his chest. The world felt so unfair, so stacked against them. The Davenports and Carmichaels of the world lived lives of luxury, while people like his mother broke their backs just to keep the lights on. Something had to change. Aaron didn't know how, but he promised himself that one day, he would make it right. Aaron woke the next morning to a knock at the door. The sound echoed through their small, quiet home, jolting him from sleep. He rubbed his eyes and stumbled to his feet, glancing at the faint sunlight filtering through the curtains. His mother's voice came from the kitchen. "Aaron, can you get that?" Linda called, her voice strained. Aaron shuffled to the door, his mind still foggy from sleep. When he opened it, his breath caught. A sleek black car was parked just outside their home. Standing on the porch was Elliot Hensley, the man from the park. His polished shoes stood out against the cracked wooden boards of the porch, and he held a small leather briefcase in one hand. "Aaron," Elliot said with a warm smile. "Good morning. May I come in?" Aaron hesitated, glancing back at his mother. She appeared in the hallway, her brow furrowing as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Who is it?" Linda asked, stepping closer. Elliot extended a hand. "Mrs. Moore? My name is Elliot Hensley. I met your son yesterday in the park. He helped my father." Linda's expression softened, but there was still a hint of caution in her eyes. "Oh, I see. Please come in," she said, stepping aside. Elliot entered, his gaze sweeping over the modest living room. The worn-out furniture and dim light seemed to deepen his expression of concern. He turned to Linda, offering her the same kind smile he'd given Aaron. "I owe your son a great deal of thanks," Elliot began. "He showed kindness to my father when he needed it most. It's rare to see such selflessness, especially in someone so young." Aaron shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Linda looked at her son, her face softening with pride. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "But we're not ones to take credit for doing the right thing." Elliot nodded, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. He held it out to Linda. "I wanted to express my gratitude. This is for you and your family," he said. Linda froze, her eyes darting to the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "It's just a small token of appreciation," Elliot said. "I know times are tough for everyone. Please, let me help." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Hensley, but we don't take charity. We work for what we have, even if it isn't much." Elliot smiled, as if he'd expected this. "I understand, which is why I have another offer." He turned to Aaron. "Your son tells me you're hardworking. I run a small tech company, and I'm looking for someone to help with administrative tasks, organizing files, managing calls, that sort of thing. The pay is fair, and the hours are flexible. Would you be interested?" Linda blinked, clearly taken aback. "You're offering me a job?" "Yes," Elliot said simply. "It's not charity. It's a genuine position, and I think you'd be a great fit." Aaron's heart raced. This was exactly what they needed. A chance to break free from the cycle of constant struggle. He looked at his mother, willing her to say yes. Linda hesitated, her pride warring with practicality. Finally, she took a deep breath. "If it's a job, then yes. I'll take it." Elliot smiled, relief washing over his face. "Wonderful. I'll have someone send over the paperwork today. You can start on Monday." Linda nodded, a small, genuine smile creeping onto her face. "Thank you, Mr. Hensley. This means a lot." Elliot glanced at Aaron, his expression thoughtful. "You've raised an incredible son, Mrs. Moore. He's the reason I'm here today." Linda looked at Aaron, her eyes glistening. "I know," she said softly. That evening, the house felt lighter. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope. Linda sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the paperwork Elliot had sent over. Aaron helped Maya with her homework while the faint glow of a candle illuminated the room. "Do you think this will really help, Aaron?" Maya asked, her small voice breaking through the silence. Aaron looked at her, his heart tightening. "I think so, Maya. Mom's going to do great." Maya nodded, her face lighting up with a hopeful smile. But as Aaron went to bed that night, The weight of the day pressed down on him. The envelope Elliot had left sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. It would have been enough to pay their overdue bills, but Linda's refusal to take it as a handout meant they still had to scrape by until her first paycheck came in. He stared at the cracks in the ceiling, his thoughts drifting to Zach and the other kids at school. They wouldn't stop taunting him just because things were starting to improve. And what about Mr. Carmichael? Their landlord had already warned Linda about raising the rent if she fell behind again. Even as a small ember of hope burned inside him, Aaron knew their struggles weren't over. The next day at school, Aaron's hope was tested. Zach and his friends were waiting for him at the gates. "Hey, Moore," Zach called, smirking as Aaron approached. Aaron kept his head down, clutching his backpack tightly. "Where's your fancy new friend, the suit guy?" Zach sneered. "Maybe he can buy you a new pair of shoes. Those look like they're about to fall apart." Aaron clenched his jaw but didn't respond. "What's the matter?" Zach taunted. "Too good to talk to us now?" Aaron stopped, turning to face Zach. "Just leave me alone, Zach. I'm not in the mood." Zach laughed, his friends joining in. "Not in the mood? You think you can just walk around here like you're better than us?" "I don't think that," Aaron said, his voice steady. "I just want to get through the day. Why can't you let me?" Zach stepped closer, his smirk fading into something colder. "Because people like you don't belong here. You're nothing more. Always have been, always will be." Aaron felt his fists tighten, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. He couldn't afford to let Zach get to him. Not today. Not when there was finally a chance for things to get better. Without another word, Aaron turned and walked away. Later that evening, as Aaron helped Joe at the garage, the words Zach had said kept echoing in his mind. The unfairness of it all burned in his chest. How some people could take everything for granted while others had to fight for every scrap. Joe must have noticed Aaron's quiet mood because he set down his wrench and clapped a hand on Aaron's shoulder. "You okay, kid?" Joe asked. Aaron hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just tired." Joe studied him for a moment, then said, "Well, don't let the world grind you down, Aaron. You're stronger than you think. And remember, you're not alone." Aaron nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't say much after that, but Joe's words stayed with him. That night, as he walked home under the fading light of the setting sun, Aaron made a silent promise. He wouldn't let people like Zach or Mr. Carmichael keep him down. He was going to fight for his family, for his future, and for justice. The first day of Linda's new job started early. Aaron sat at the kitchen table, watching his mother double-check the contents of her worn handbag. She smoothed her neatly pressed blouse, the best piece of clothing she owned. Her hair was tied back tightly, and although she tried to hide it, Aaron could see the nervous tremor in her hands. "You'll do great, Ma," Aaron said, his voice steady. Linda glanced at him, her lips curving into a small smile. "Thanks, sweetheart. I hope I don't mess this up." Aaron reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You won't. You're the hardest worker I know." A car horn honked outside, and they both looked toward the window. A sleek black car waited at the curb. Elliot was punctual. "Go on, Ma," Aaron said. "I'll take care of Maya and everything else." Linda hesitated, her gaze flickering between Aaron and the door. "All right," she said softly. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Thank you." Aaron watched as she stepped outside, her posture straight and her chin held high. As the car drove away, he turned back to the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves. He had a long day ahead. At school, Aaron was determined to focus on his classes, but the day proved to be a challenge. As he walked through the crowded hallways, whispers followed him. "That's him," one girl murmured to her friend. "The kid who's always hanging around the garage. I heard his mom works for one of those rich guys now," another voice said, snickering. Aaron clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep walking. He couldn't let their words bother him. But Zach was waiting. Aaron had barely stepped into the cafeteria when Zach sauntered up, flanked by his usual group of cronies. "Hey, Moore," Zach called out, his voice carrying across the room. "How's the charity life treating you?" Aaron sighed, clutching his lunchbox tightly. "Just leave me alone, Zach." "Leave you alone?" Zach echoed, smirking. "Why would I do that?" You're the only entertainment around here." The other boys laughed as Zach continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Your mom working for that guy now? What's she doing? Cleaning his floors. Bet she's real good with a mop." Aaron froze, his entire body tensing. He turned slowly, his eyes locking on Zach's smug expression. "Say that again," Aaron said, his voice low. Zach's smirk widened. "What? That your mom's just another?" Before he could finish, Aaron shoved Zach hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back into the lunch table. The cafeteria went silent, all eyes on the two boys. Zach recovered quickly, his face darkening with anger. He stepped forward, grabbing Aaron by the collar. "You want to fight more?" Aaron's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "I don't want to fight, but I'm done letting you run your mouth." A teacher's voice cut through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" Both boys froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the voice. Mr. Howard, the school's no-nonsense principal, strode toward them, his sharp eyes darting between Aaron and Zach. "Both of you, my office." "Now," Mr. Howard said firmly. Sitting outside the principal's office, Aaron stared down at his hands. His knuckles were white from clenching his fists, but his anger hadn't subsided. Zach sat a few feet away, smirking as if he'd already won. "You're in for it now, Moore," Zach said under his breath. "Guys like us don't get punished. But you? You'll be lucky if they let you stay." Aaron ignored him, but the words stung. He knew Zach was probably right. When Mr. Howard called them into his office, he didn't mince words. Both boys received warnings, but Aaron's came with a harsher tone. "You're a good student, Aaron," Mr. Howard said, his expression stern. "But I can't have you causing trouble, no matter the reason. Keep your head down and focus on your work. Don't let me see you in here again." Aaron nodded, swallowing the bitter lump in his throat. He wanted to argue, to explain that Zach had provoked him, but he knew it wouldn't matter. That evening, Aaron returned to Joe's garage, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of work. Joe greeted him with a knowing look as he entered. "Rough day, kid?" Joe asked, leaning against the workbench. Aaron nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah, got into it with Zach again." Joe sighed, crossing his arms. "That Carmichael kid? He's nothing but trouble. But you can't let him drag you down, Aaron. You've got bigger things to focus on." Aaron frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Why do guys like him always get away with everything? His family owns half the town, and they treat everyone else like garbage. It's not fair. Joe studied him for a moment, then said, "Life's not fair, kid. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting for what's right. You just have to be smart about it." Aaron nodded slowly, the weight of Joe's words settling on him. Meanwhile, Linda's first day at work brought its own challenges. The office was pristine and modern, a stark contrast to the world she was used to. Elliot introduced her to the team, a mix of polite smiles and subtle glances that made her feel out of place. She spent the day learning the ropes, answering calls, filing documents, and trying to keep up with the fast pace of the office. By the end of the day, her feet ached, and her nerves were frayed, but there was a sense of accomplishment in her chest. As Elliot walked her to the car, he said, "You did great today, Linda. I know this is all new, but you'll settle in quickly." "Thank you," Linda said, her voice quiet but sincere. Elliot hesitated, then added, "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." "I mean it." Linda nodded, unsure how to respond. She didn't fully trust him yet, but she couldn't deny the opportunity he'd given her. When Linda arrived home that evening, she found Aaron sitting at the kitchen table, helping Maya with her homework. The sight brought a tired smile to her face. "How was your day, Ma?" Aaron asked, looking up. Linda hesitated, then said, "It was different, but I think I'll get the hang of it." Aaron nodded, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. "I'm proud of you, Ma. You're doing something amazing." Linda walked over and kissed the top of his head. "I'm proud of you too, Aaron. Always." That night, as the family sat together in the dim light of a single candle, Aaron felt a flicker of hope. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. But deep down, Aaron knew the world wouldn't let them find peace so easily. Resentment lingered in the shadows, and the fight for justice was just beginning. Aaron leaned back against the rough bark of an old oak tree in Haven Park, his mind restless. The day had been long and frustrating, filled with Zach's taunts at school and the nagging weight of their struggles at home. His mother's new job was a glimmer of hope, but the hurdles they faced seemed endless. He stared at the skyline, his jaw tightening as his thoughts drifted to his father. The memory was faint now. His deep laugh, the way he carried Maya on his shoulders, the worn toolbox he always brought home. His father had died when Aaron was just 9, crushed in a factory accident at Davenport Industries. Officially, it had been ruled as a tragic mishap, but Linda had always suspected negligence. Aaron's hands clenched into fists. He thought of Zach, the son of the Davenport's closest business allies, strutting around as if the world owed him everything. The same system that had failed his father now protected people like Zach. It wasn't fair, and Aaron was tired of pretending otherwise. That evening, while helping at Joe's garage, Aaron finally voiced what had been simmering inside him. "Joe," he began, his voice hesitant, "you've been in this town a long time, right?" Joe glanced up from the car engine he was tinkering with, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, a long time. Why?" Aaron hesitated, then asked, "Do you remember my dad's accident? At the Davenport factory?" Joe's expression darkened. He set his wrench down and wiped his hands on a rag. "I do. Your dad was a good man, Aaron. One of the best workers that place ever had." Aaron nodded, swallowing hard. Do you think it was really just an accident?" Joe sighed heavily, leaning against the workbench. "Aaron, there were a lot of rumors back then. People said the safety equipment wasn't up to code, that the Davenports cut corners to save money. But no one could prove anything. They're powerful people, and folks were scared to speak out." Aaron's chest tightened. He'd always suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. Why didn't anyone do anything? Joe's gaze softened. "Because they're rich, kid. They've got lawyers, connections, and money to bury the truth. Going up against them? It's like David against Goliath, except Goliath has an army." Aaron's jaw clenched. Maybe it's time someone tried again. Joe studied him for a long moment. "That's a dangerous road, Aaron. But if you're serious, you might want to talk to Beatrice Wells. She used to work at the factory back then. If anyone knows what really happened, it's her." The next day, after school, Aaron made his way to the outskirts of town. Beatrice Wells lived in a small, run-down house at the end of a quiet street. The yard was overgrown, and the paint on the house was peeling, but the windows were clean, and the place had a quiet dignity. Aaron knocked on the door, his heart pounding. After a moment, it creaked open, and an older woman with sharp eyes and graying hair peered out. "Yes?" she asked, her voice wary. "Mrs. Wells?" Aaron said. "My name's Aaron Moore. My dad, he worked at the Davenport factory. He died there." Beatrice's eyes softened, and she stepped aside. "Come in, boy. Let's talk." Inside, the house was modest but neat. Beatrice led Aaron to a small kitchen table and poured him a glass of water. She sat across from him, her expression serious. "I remember your father," she said after a moment. "He was a good man. Hard-working, kind. Everyone liked him." Aaron nodded, his throat tight. "I need to know the truth, Mrs. Wells. Was the factory really unsafe? Was my dad's death preventable?" Beatrice sighed, leaning back in her chair. "The factory was a death trap," she said bluntly. "The machines were outdated, the safety protocols were a joke, and anyone who complained was either fired or silenced. Your father, he tried to speak up. He told the supervisors that the equipment needed repairs, but they didn't listen. Said it was too expensive." Aaron's heart pounded. Why didn't anyone come forward after he died? "Because the Davenports made sure we couldn't," Beatrice said bitterly. "They paid off inspectors, threatened workers, and buried evidence. I tried to talk once, gave a statement to a lawyer. But the next day, I lost my job and I couldn't get hired anywhere else in town. They made sure of that." Aaron's hands trembled as he listened. "Do you still have anything? Proof? Documents?" Beatrice hesitated, then stood and walked to a cabinet. She pulled out a battered folder and handed it to Aaron. "I kept these," she said quietly. "Reports, memos, Even a letter your father wrote to the management. I've been holding on to them for years, hoping someone would come along who could use them. Aaron opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Each page was like a puzzle piece, painting a damning picture of negligence and greed. This is enough to prove they were responsible, Aaron said, his voice firm. Beatrice gave him a sad smile. It might be, but getting justice won't be easy, Aaron. The Davenports will fight you with everything they have. Aaron nodded, determination burning in his chest. I don't care. My dad deserves justice, and I'm not backing down. That night, Aaron sat at the kitchen table, the folders spread out before him. Linda walked in, her face lined with exhaustion, and froze when she saw the papers. What's all this? She asked, her voice wary. Aaron looked up at her, his eyes blazing. It's the truth, Ma. About Dad. The factory, what they did. I'm going to make them pay. Linda's face paled, and she sat down heavily. Aaron, you don't understand what you're getting into. The Davenports, they'll ruin us if we go after them. I don't care, Aaron said fiercely. They already ruined us when they killed Dad. I can't just let them get away with it. Linda's hands trembled as she reached for one of the papers. I've always known, she whispered. I've always known they were responsible, but I was too scared to fight them. Aaron leaned forward, his voice softening. You don't have to be scared anymore, Ma. We'll do this together. Linda looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. After a long moment, she nodded. Okay, but if we're doing this, we're doing it the right way. No shortcuts, no risks we can't handle. Promise me. I promise, Aaron said, though he wasn't sure he could keep it. As the night stretched on, Aaron and Linda pored over the documents together. For the first time, they felt like they had a chance, a small but real chance, to take back the justice they'd been denied. But in the back of Aaron's mind, he knew the fight ahead would be anything but easy. The Davenports wouldn't go down without a war. Aaron didn't sleep that night. The papers Beatrice had given him were spread across the small kitchen table, illuminated by a dim, flickering candle. His mother sat beside him, her face pale and her hands trembling as she sifted through the damning evidence. Each document was a sharp reminder of what they had lost. Maintenance logs left unsigned, emails ignoring safety recommendations. And then, the letter, his father's last plea to the factory's management, begging them to fix the failing equipment. It had been ignored. This is everything we need, Aaron said quietly, though his voice was laced with uncertainty. Linda glanced at him, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. It's not enough to just have this, she said. We'll need help. A lawyer. Someone who can actually make this count in court. Aaron nodded, but his stomach twisted. Lawyers cost money, money they didn't have. The next day, Aaron skipped school and headed to Keene & Associates, a small law firm on the other side of town. He'd heard of Mr. Simon Keene, an old-school attorney with a reputation for taking on powerful people. The office was cramped and cluttered, but the man behind the desk was sharp-eyed and alert, despite his graying hair. He looked up as Aaron entered. You're Aaron Moore, right? Keene asked, motioning for him to sit. Joe Garcia told me you might be coming. Said you're looking for justice. Aaron nodded, swallowing hard. I want to take down Davenport Industries. I have proof that they caused my dad's death. Will you help us? Keene studied Aaron for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest with you, kid. Going after the Davenports is like poking a bear with a stick. They have the money and power to bury this case before it even gets to trial. Aaron's jaw clenched. I don't care. They need to pay for what they did. Keene nodded slowly. I respect your determination. I'll take the case, but you need to know what you're up against. This is going to get ugly. Aaron nodded, his chest tightening. We're ready. As word of the lawsuit spread, the Davenports retaliated swiftly. Within days, Linda lost her job at Elliot's office. She came home that evening, her face pale and her hands shaking. They fired me, she said, setting her bag down on the counter. Said they didn't want the distraction. Aaron's stomach dropped. He had expected pushback, but not this quickly. I'm sorry, Ma, he said quietly. Linda shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. Don't be. I knew this was a risk. I'll find something else. Aaron nodded, though he felt a knot of guilt twisting in his chest. The next blow came at school. Zach and his friends vandalized the garage where Aaron worked, smashing tools and spray-painting crude messages on the walls. When Aaron arrived for his shift, Joe stood outside, staring at the damage with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, Joe," Aaron said, his voice heavy with guilt. "This is my fault." Joe turned to him, shaking his head. "No, Aaron. This is on them. They're scared, and they're lashing out because they know they're in the wrong. Don't let this stop you." Aaron nodded, but the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. As the weeks passed, the case began to take shape. Keene filed a formal lawsuit against Davenport Industries, citing negligence and wrongful death. The factory's history of safety violations was exposed, and the town started paying attention. But with attention came danger. Aaron noticed a black car parked near their house one evening, its engine idling as the driver watched from the shadows. At school, Zach made veiled threats about what would happen if Aaron didn't back off. "You don't know what you're doing, Moore," Zach sneered one afternoon in the hallway. "You think you can win this? My dad will crush you." Aaron met his gaze, his voice steady. "We'll see." One night, there was a knock at the door. Aaron opened it cautiously to find Elliot standing on the porch, his expression grim. "I heard what happened," Elliot said, stepping inside. "The Davenports are going to come after you with everything they have." Aaron folded his arms, his jaw tight. "I'm not backing down." "I know," Elliot said, "and that's why I want to help." Aaron frowned. "Why? You're one of them." Elliot's expression softened. "Not all of us are like them, Aaron. My father taught me the importance of doing what's right, even when it's hard. I have resources, connections. Let me use them to support your case." Linda, who had been listening from the kitchen, stepped forward. "What's the catch?" she asked. "There's no catch," Elliot said. "I just want to make things right." Aaron and Linda exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Okay," Linda said, "but don't expect us to trust you right away." Elliot smiled faintly. "Fair enough." As the case gained momentum, more people came forward. Workers who had been fired from the factory shared their stories, painting a grim picture of neglect and corruption. Keene gathered evidence tirelessly, building a case that even the Davenports couldn't ignore. But the pressure on Aaron and his family mounted. Their landlord, Mr. Carmichael, delivered an eviction notice, claiming they were behind on rent, even though they weren't. "This is retaliation," Linda said, her voice trembling as she read the notice. "We'll figure it out," Aaron said firmly, though his heart was pounding. The breaking point came when Zach and his friends cornered Aaron after school one day. "You should have listened more," Zach said, shoving Aaron against the lockers. "You're gonna regret this." Aaron pushed him back, his voice sharp. "I'm not scared of you, Zach. You and your family don't own me." Zach's face twisted with anger, but before he could say anything, a teacher appeared, and the group scattered. Aaron stood there, his hands shaking. He was scared, terrified, even, but he refused to let it show. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, Aaron's resolve hardened. "They're trying to break us," he said, "but we're not going to let them." Linda nodded, her eyes glistening with determination. "We've come this far. We're not giving up now." Aaron reached across the table, taking her hand. Together, they faced the pile of papers that represented their fight for justice. The Davenports had wealth, power, and influence, but Aaron had something stronger, the truth, and he wasn't going to stop until it was heard. The day of the trial arrived, and the small courthouse was packed. The entire town seemed to have shown up, their curiosity and emotions palpable in the tense air. On one side sat Aaron, Linda, their lawyer Simon Keene, and a small but determined group of supporters, former factory workers, neighbors, and friends like Joe. On the other side were the Davenports, their legal team a polished wall of high-priced suits and confident smirks. Zach's father, Victor Davenport, sat at the center, his icy gaze scanning the courtroom. To him, this was just another nuisance to crush. Aaron sat beside his mother, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His chest felt tight, but when Linda placed her hand on his, her warmth steadied him. "We have the truth on our side," she whispered. Aaron nodded, though his stomach churned. The truth wasn't always enough, especially against people like the Davenports. The trial began with opening arguments. Keene spoke with quiet intensity, laying out the case. How Davenport Industries had ignored safety regulations, how their negligence led to the death of Aaron's father, and how they had systematically silenced anyone who tried to hold them accountable. On the other side, the Davenport's lead attorney, Marissa Kane, dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated and painted Aaron's family as desperate people looking for a payday. Aaron's jaw clenched, but he kept his focus. He couldn't let their words shake him. The first few days were grueling. The Davenport's lawyers bombarded the court with technical jargon, obscure legal defenses, and character attacks on Aaron's family. They brought in witnesses who painted the factory as a model of efficiency and safety, claiming that any accidents were the fault of careless workers. Aaron's blood boiled as he listened. He wanted to shout, to stand up and call out their lies, but Keene placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Trust me," Keene said quietly. "We will have our turn." Their turn came when Beatrice Wells took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she described the conditions at the factory. Her voice was steady, but her words were damning. Outdated machinery, ignored warnings, and a culture of fear that silenced anyone who spoke up. "They knew the equipment was dangerous," Beatrice said, her gaze fixed on Victor Davenport. "We told them. Aaron's father told them. And they did nothing." Marissa Kane tried to discredit her, questioning her memory and motives, but Beatrice held firm. "I am here because it is the right thing to do," she said. "Something you would not understand." Next, Keene presented the documents Beatrice had saved: maintenance logs with skip repairs, emails dismissing safety concerns, and Aaron's father's letter to management. Each piece of evidence was like a hammer striking the Davenport's carefully constructed facade. When it was Aaron's turn to testify, he took a deep breath and stepped onto the stand. The room felt suffocating, every eye in the courtroom fixed on him. Keene's questions were gentle but direct. Aaron described his father's dedication to his work, the night of the accident, and the impact it had on their family. "My dad wasn't just a worker," Aaron said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "He was a husband, a father, a man who wanted to do the right thing. And he deserved better than to die because someone decided their profits were more important than his life." The courtroom was silent. Even Marissa Kane hesitated before standing to cross-examine him. Her questions were sharp, designed to rattle him, but Aaron held his ground. He spoke with the quiet strength that came from years of hardship, refusing to let her twist his words. The turning point came when a surprise witness was called. Elliot Hensley stood and walked to the stand, his tailored suit immaculate, but his expression serious. The courtroom murmured in surprise. He was one of their own, a member of the town's elite. "I was once part of their world," Elliot began, his voice calm but firm. "But I cannot stand by and watch injustice go unanswered." He described what he had witnessed during his time in the business world: the backroom deals, the silencing of whistleblowers, and the calculated efforts to protect profits at all costs. When asked why he was testifying, Elliot glanced at Aaron and Linda. "Because they remind me of what I have lost," he said. "Because I owe it to their family, and to mine, to tell the truth." Victor Davenport's composure cracked for the first time, his jaw tightening as Elliot spoke. The trial stretched on, each side presenting their final arguments. Keene's closing statement was simple but powerful. He reminded the jury that this was not just about one family's tragedy. It was about holding powerful people accountable for their actions. "Justice is not just for the wealthy and well-connected," Keene said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "It is for everyone. And it is time the Davenports learned that." After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Aaron's heart pounded as the foreperson stood, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We find Davenport Industries guilty of negligence," the foreperson said, "and we award damages to the Moore family." The room erupted. Supporters cheered, while the Davenports' lawyers scrambled to plan an appeal. Victor Davenport stormed out, his face a mask of fury. Aaron sat frozen, the words sinking in. They had won. Linda pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." That evening, the more family gathered at home, their small kitchen filled with laughter and relief. Maya clung to Aaron, smiling brightly, while Linda prepared a simple meal. For the first time in years, the future did not feel so heavy. But Aaron knew this was not just their victory, it was a step toward something bigger. The trial had exposed the Davenports' corruption, sparking a wave of demands for reform. Workers in the town were organizing, pushing for better conditions and fair treatment. Aaron looked around at his family, his heart swelling with pride. Justice had come at a price, but it was worth it, and he knew this was only the beginning. As the candlelight flickered across the table, Aaron made a silent vow to keep fighting, to keep building, and to never let the light of hope fade again. The days after the trial were a whirlwind for Aaron and his family. Their victory over the Davenports sent ripples through the town. The once invisible struggles of the factory workers were now out in the open, and for the first time, people began to talk about change. Linda sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the stack of mail. For years, it had been nothing but overdue notices and eviction threats. Today, there was something new. A letter from Davenport Industries' new management offered the Moore family a formal apology and outlined a settlement to ensure their financial stability for the future. "Can you believe it?" Linda said, her voice trembling with emotion. Aaron sat across from her, his face calm but his heart racing. "They had no choice, Ma. Not after what we proved in court." Linda nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "It doesn't bring your father back, but maybe this is a start." Aaron reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It's more than a start. It's a chance to rebuild." The community rallied behind the Moores. Joe's garage had been repaired thanks to donations from neighbors, and Joe himself had become a voice for the workers in the town. He organized meetings to discuss better wages, safety regulations, and ways to hold factory owners accountable. Aaron attended one of these meetings, sitting quietly at the back while Joe spoke. He marveled at the transformation in his old mentor, whose quiet wisdom had become a rallying cry for others. When the meeting ended, Joe approached Aaron. "You did good, kid," Joe said, clapping him on the shoulder. Aaron shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you, Joe." Joe grinned. "Don't sell yourself short. You've got more fight in you than most grown men I know. Keep that fire." Elliot Hensley became an unlikely ally in the town's fight for justice. Having testified against the Davenports, he resigned from his own corporate role and committed himself to advocacy. He offered Linda another job, this time as an administrative assistant for a nonprofit he was establishing to support workers' rights. When he showed up at their home with the offer, Linda hesitated. "Why are you doing this, Elliot?" she asked. Elliot's expression softened. "Because I've spent too much of my life benefiting from a broken system. It's time I do something to fix it." Linda accepted the position, her pride softened by the sincerity in Elliot's voice. Meanwhile, Aaron's life began to change in ways he hadn't imagined. One afternoon, as he was working alongside Joe at the garage, a sleek black car pulled up outside. Aaron tensed, the memory of the Davenports' intimidation tactics still fresh in his mind. A middle-aged woman stepped out, her suit sharp and her expression kind. "Aaron Moore?" she asked, holding out a business card. "Yeah, that's me," Aaron said warily, wiping his hands on a rag. "My name is Marion Foster. I'm with the State Engineering Scholarship Fund. I heard about your story, and I wanted to offer you something." Aaron blinked, stunned. "A scholarship?" Marianne nodded. "We're impressed by your resilience, Aaron, and your work ethic. You've shown a lot of potential, and we'd like to help you pursue a future in engineering." Aaron glanced at Joe, who was grinning from ear to ear. "Take it, kid," Joe said. "You've earned it." Aaron's chest swelled with pride. "Thank you, Miss Foster. I won't let you down." At school, Aaron found that things had shifted. Zach and his group of bullies had gone quiet, their power diminished by the trial's revelations. "Hey, Aaron," Alex called, waving him over at lunch. Aaron smiled, joining his friend at their usual table. "What's up?" Alex grinned. "Heard about the scholarship. That's amazing, man." Aaron shrugged, though he couldn't hide his smile. "Thanks. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it." "Well, don't get too famous on us," Alex teased. We need you here to keep us grounded. For the first time in a long time, Aaron felt like he belonged. At home, life was finally stabilizing. The settlement from Davenport Industries allowed Linda to pay off their debts and repair the house. The electricity was back on, and the pantry was full for the first time in years. One evening, as the family sat around the kitchen table, Maya looked up at Aaron, her eyes wide. Does this mean we're not poor anymore? Aaron hesitated, glancing at Linda. It means we're safe now, Linda said gently, and we're going to keep working hard so we never have to worry like that again. Maya nodded, smiling. The town continued to change in the wake of the trial. Davenport Industries, under intense public scrutiny, underwent a complete overhaul of its operations. New safety measures were implemented, and former workers like Beatrice Wells were offered compensation and opportunities for retraining. Aaron visited Beatrice one afternoon, bringing her a small bouquet of flowers as thanks. "You're a good boy, Aaron," Beatrice said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be so proud of you." Aaron's throat tightened, and he nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Wells. I couldn't have done it without your help." As the months passed, Aaron found himself thinking more about the future. His scholarship opened doors he hadn't dared to dream of, and he spent his evenings poring over books about mechanics and engineering. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table, Linda joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. "You're going to do great things, Aaron," she said softly. Aaron looked up, surprised. "I'm just doing what I have to, Ma." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening. "You're doing so much more than that. You're building a life. For all of us." Aaron swallowed hard, nodding. "I learned from the best." The story ended where it began, at the park bench where Aaron had first met Elliot's father. But this time, Aaron sat with Maya, the two of them watching children play in the fading sunlight. "Do you think Dad can see us?" Maya asked suddenly. Aaron wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he can, and I think he's proud." The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the park. The fight hadn't been easy, and the scars would always remain. But for the first time, Aaron felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The future was theirs to build, and he was ready.